Around the world today, there's a huge disparity between the rich, developed Western world and the so-called Global South. Whilst many of the countries in the Global South, such as China and Saudi Arabia, have been able to develop their economies and institutions to more closely mirror their Western counterparts, many countries still find themselves at the bottom of the economic and geopolitical food chain. This raises a key question. Why are some countries able to develop whilst others are not? Asking different people this question will often yield very different answers. From the failure of right-wing policies such as free market economics, the failure of left-wing policies such as the redistribution of wealth, or the rampant corruption found in many developing countries, the list is endless with potential explanations and solutions to this dilemma. One answer that you'll often see scattered throughout many responses to this is that it is the fault of the wealthier countries that many states are unable to develop. Whilst this may be seen as playing the blame game, the historical context of this accusation is rooted in the colonial past of many parts of the world. One of the best examples of this is a study that compared India and Britain in 1800. In his work, Shahid Alam observed how the disparities in development between Western Europe on one hand and India and the Middle East on the other were in fact very small or non-existent. In reality, wage levels were actually higher in India than they were in Britain at the end of the 18th century. Why then was the Western world able to develop at a rate that vastly outperformed their counterparts? One potential explanation for this lies in their colonial past. The most common explanation for different levels of development in the post-World War II world was Modernization theory. Modernization theory follows the line of thought that countries naturally pass through different stages of development. From an initial rural agrarian society to an industrialised society, and finally to what we see today in post-industrial countries such as Britain and the USA, with everything in between being a different stage of development. For modernization theorists, this model is based on the development process seen in Europe, and they believe that countries that are less developed are simply at an earlier stage and should follow the examples of countries that have already passed through that stage. Whilst traditionally academics have believed that it was the entrepreneurial flair of the West at the end of the Renaissance period that led to their successful mass industrialisation, in reality much of this came off the back of cheap raw materials imported from Europe's colonial empires. For example, after 1800, the Indian states were slowly occupied by Britain and forced to maintain an economy that revolved around the cultivation of cotton. This cotton was then exported to Britain, where it was manufactured in the textile industry, enabling the Industrial Revolution to proceed at the pace that it did. India was not alone in this. Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of the Congo are just two more examples of countries that were hampered by the imperialist policies aimed at providing domestic factories with cheap raw materials. Much of the early development in the United States also came from less than ethical sources. Even before American independence, hundreds of thousands of African slaves were shipped across the Atlantic to work on plantations in the New World. The trade triangle, as it became known, of slaves being taken from West Africa to the Americas to work on plantations providing raw materials to Europe, which were then manufactured and exported around the world, greatly benefited the early industrialization of Europe. After American independence, slaves remained a key part of the US economy up until the abolition following the Civil War. What has only recently been discussed by mainstream academics is the long-term damage done to African nations that were stripped of their population during this period. This again gave the Western world a one-up over other nations in how they were able to economically outperform the rest of the world. But what about today? Why is it countries that have for decades been free of imperial rule are still reliant on the same kind of raw material exports that they were in the 19th and 20th centuries? One of the main reasons is that many aid packages to these countries come with conditions. For example, a liberalisation of the domestic markets, lower barriers to entry for foreign multinational companies, strict restrictions on government spending, and of course free trade. These conditions have left many poorer states forced into unequal trade with the West, reproducing the inequality created during the colonial era. Dependency theory, in contrast to modernization theory, seeks to explain that global inequality is promoted and reproduced by rich countries that benefit from cheap imports and sizable exports gained through free trade with the developing world. As weaker members of the global economy, poorer countries are kept dependent on those cheap exports that are unable to develop their economies further, entrenching the global imbalance. One cornerstone of aid in the post-World War II era were structural adjustment programs. These were loan packages provided by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, given to poorer countries facing economic crises. Structural adjustment programs required developing countries to enforce strict free market policies and reduce government spending to sustainable levels. Since the 1990s, however, these have become much less common, as generic free market reforms often did little to address the country's specific problems a state was facing, and although they often helped grow the economy, they did little to tackle issues such as poverty and inequality. A cynical view of these conditional aid packages is, as dependency theorists suggest, that they trap developing nations in unequal trade, with the main benefits going to richer nations that are able to gain access to cheap raw materials which are later sold as finished goods around the world, thus giving little chance for the poorer nation to develop their own economy. One accusation is that this has become a form of neocolonialism, or financial colonialism. This is where control and exploitation of these countries is continued. However, the form of control is economic rather than direct. Although certainly there is a huge power imbalance, the relationship today between many poor countries and their Western counterparts is inherently not colonial. Firstly, during the colonial era, one of the main justifications for direct control was that these regions could not or were not able to govern themselves. Today, countries that are offered aid packages have choice to refuse. Although the alternative is that they pretty much have no money, the government's right to say no underlines a different type of relationship. The poorer country's right to national sovereignty, although undermined by the practical implications of refusal, is never actually questioned. But how fair is it to place the entire blame on the rich countries for this inequality? After all, many have huge foreign aid budgets aimed at helping countries tackle development issues. Many are now forgiven foreign debt owed to them, and structural adjustment programs aimed at liberalising their markets are no longer enforced quite as strictly. Alongside this, it is also impossible to ignore that many of these countries have been torn apart by wars, dictators and rebels since achieving independence. Whilst part of this can be put down to how the division of Africa between European powers ignored ethnic and tribal lines, even countries that do not have these ethnic and religious differences have still faced internal strife. It is also worth noting that some countries since independence have benefited greatly from the institutions left behind by their former masters. For example, Botswana has been able to grow in a much more sustainable way, using their abundance of high-value raw material exports to create a long-term growth fund. Much of the fiscal revenues they received from these exports go towards projects such as infrastructure, healthcare and education. They were able to do this as Britain left them strong institutions. They were able to collect and spend revenue efficiently. Alongside ingrained democratic values, Botswana was able to avoid many of the issues that plagued other countries. As a result of what the British Empire left behind, Botswana has been able to improve standards of education, healthcare and life expectancy significantly compared to other African nations. It is also impossible to ignore the role that domestic governments play. Many East Asian countries, including South Korea and India, use protectionist policies, such as tariffs on foreign imports, to allow their domestic industries to grow to the point where they would be competitive when they opened up their markets to the world economy. The successful policies implemented by countries in Asia such as India and South Korea, and Africa such as Botswana, shows that competent government policies have significant impact on the development of a nation. Answering the question of to what extent are poor countries poor because of rich countries is a question that yields no definitive answer. Historically, yes, colonialism had a huge negative impact on these regions for the benefit of others. Often well-intentioned policies in the post-World War II era also left developing states in unequal trade with the West. Yet despite this, much is being done by developed countries to help reconcile this imbalance. Aid, debt forgiveness and foreign investment are all helping poorer countries to improve their economic and living standards. As with all things political, the extent to which we can simply blame rich countries for poorer countries' woes is hotly contested, and the answer for one country may very well be different from that of another. We hope you enjoyed this video today and learned something new. If you did, please like and subscribe and let us know your thoughts in the comments.